Time for another Pussalicious Puscast. This is covering the last 2 weeks of April 2014. A time notable for some serious butt-kicking of Houston by the Portland Trailblazers. If you are new to this Puscast, be aware that references are available online, and if you are listening through iTunes, on the podcast itself. Otherwise, go to my growing multimedia empire at edgydoc.com to see links to my books and my podcasts and my blogs and my lions and tigers and bears, oh my. And of course, it's your duty as a citizen of the world to write me glowing reviews on iTunes. Yes, duty. And we will move on now to the literature. There's a report of a measles outbreak in New York City. Well, that's no big news. Because of declining vaccination rates in some populations, we have been seeing more measles in the United States and especially in Europe. What makes this one particularly interesting is that the index case, who got measles from an unknown source, although she worked in an area with lots of foreign travelers, developed measles even though at age 3 and 4 she had had both of the measles vaccine. There were a grand total of 231 secondary exposures, of which 4 developed measles who also had had both measles vaccines. Everyone in infectious diseases, of course, knows that the vaccines are not 100% and that occasionally you can still get diseases even if you've been immunized. It underscores the importance of herd immunity, since it does take a certain volume of people to keep an infection moving in a population. I have no doubt that the anti-vaccine wackaloons will use this outbreak as an example that the vaccine doesn't work. Given that the rest of the contacts did not get measles, it's probably more likely that it did. If you haven't heard, the first case of MERS coronavirus has been isolated in the United States, and someone who traveled to Saudi Arabia probably picked it up there. It's of minimal risk to others, though I do like this particular quote in the article. Quote, "We should not be surprised if additional cases are identified among healthcare providers who had close contact with this patient before the patient was isolated and special precautions were implemented." End of quote. Now, this is a virus that looks to be predominantly a camel virus, as best I can determine, and that spread from human to human does occur and is unusual, but I always like to harp on the fact that coughing is an extremely efficient way of spreading infections, and I'm amazed at how cavalier people are about coughing when they're seeing people. The reason you have the patient turn their head and cough when examining for a hernia is not that it makes the hernia stand out more. Turning the head prevents the patient from coughing on you. And during respiratory virus seasons, it's a good thing to not have patients cough on you. Unfortunately, given the ubiquity of coughing during viral seasons, people pretty much ignore coughing until it's a tubercular on an airplane or a MERS in your hospital. I have mentioned in the past that chikungunya is coming our way, but where did this particular strain come from? There are 3 genotypes of chikungunya. There's the West African, the East Central and South African, and the Asian forms of chikungunya. Evidently, there are some strains that have a mutation that facilitates its replication in the Aldopictus mosquito, which is the tiger mosquito seen all throughout the United States now, recent import from Asia. So they took the chikungunya viruses and they looked at where the one in the Caribbean comes from, and it looks like the chikungunya that's whipping through the Caribbean is the same one that has been in the Philippines and China, and that it probably originated in the Philippines. I doubt a mosquito flew all the way from China or the Philippines to the Caribbean, so it probably got there by way of an airplane. But as I mentioned before, chikungunya will probably, my bet, is spread throughout the United States as rapidly as did West Nile. And of course, the spread of infections by airplanes in humans is not unheard of for things like dengue. This study out of PLOS looked at the spread of dengue in Brazil, and they estimate that the spread of the virus of 0.5 kilometers per day throughout Brazil is due to introduction of new strains of dengue and then spread by airplanes, by both humans on airplanes and probably mosquitoes on airplanes. I wonder if mosquitoes can get a first-class ticket. But it would appear that it's the airplane that takes the human and the mosquito through Brazil and spreads dengue rather than the spread of the mosquito proper. I'm sure Homeland Security will keep it out of the U.S. There's all these fine points with HIV treatments and outcomes. For example, what happens to people who get virally suppressed but their CD4 counts do not come back up? Well, this study out of CID shows that they have higher mortality rates than those who get a CD4 count that bumps above 200. And it turns out that the lower the CD4 counts are, the higher the 6-year mortality rate was in this particular epidemiologic study. Patients tended to die of non-AIDS defining causes of death and non-AIDS cancers, but exactly what these were and what the comorbidities were, such as smoking, were evidently not available to the researchers. But it is safe to say that if your CD4 counts are 200 and below, even if you are virally suppressed, you do have a significant risk for mortality in the upcoming years. What is now needed, of course, is exactly why they died and if they had reversible risk factors. Just to remember a little epidemiology, there are about 12,000 oropharyngeal cancers in the United States. These are mostly squamous carcinomas. Would these be preventable? Well, they went back and they looked at all the biopsies in this study, and they found that 72% of the oropharyngeal cancers were positive for human papillomavirus. And of these, 62% were from vaccine types, 16 and 18. So given that piece of information, you could predict that perhaps 60-70% of oropharyngeal carcinomas in the United States could be prevented by the HPV vaccine in men and women. Yet another reason why it would be eminently reasonable to give the HPV vaccine to males. Borrelia species are common, and there's a new one described, Miyamotoi, M-I-Y-A-M-O-T-O-I, which I'm probably mispronouncing, as always. This is found throughout the United States. It causes a viral-like syndrome in most people, and there was one case of a meningoencephalitis in an immunocompetent patient. This is spread by black-legged ticks, Ixodes scapularis, and they looked to see what the incidence of this Borrelia was across Canada. And about 0.5% of ticks all throughout Canada contain this particular Borrelia. It's more common in the United States, but is yet another infection to think about if there are a tick bite. I just saw a patient who had a tick bite and shortly thereafter had flu-like symptoms. Never had a diagnosis. Got better on doxycycline, although it could have been true and unrelated, and could very well have been Borrelia. And as long as we're on the topic of Borrelia, the CDC is putting out a warning against a new culture method for Borrelia burgdorferi, the cause of Lyme disease. They looked at this particular test and, quote, published methods and results for this laboratory-developed test have been reviewed by the CDC. The review raised serious concerns about false positive tests caused by laboratory contamination and the potential for misdiagnosis, end of quote. So don't trust the culture of Lyme. The interesting thing is patients often believe that if the lab is CLIA certified, then the tests are legitimate. Having CLIA certification is a lot like having your restaurant judged by its cleanliness. It doesn't, however, have anything to do with the quality of the food. And there are many labs that offer their own Lyme tests that have not been validated by the FDA. Often these labs, as best I can tell, are beloved by naturopaths and end up misdiagnosing patients who don't indeed have Lyme disease. But once you have a lab test that's positive, no matter how good or bad the lab, it's hard to dissuade the patient that they don't have it. I also note in passing 2 interesting articles. One entitled Lyme disease, neurology, neurobiology, and behavior, a nice viewpoint in the most recent clinical infectious diseases, and the New England Journal of Medicine has a clinical practice on Lyme disease. For those of you who are interested, the references are available online. Vancomycin is often considered to be a strong, big gun, powerful antibiotic, adjectives that always mark the user as an idiot when it comes to the use of antibiotics. Vancomycin, however, probably is a piece of crap antibiotic, and yet another study shows that the use of vancomycin instead of a beta-lactam is a bad idea. They looked at enterococcal bacteremias and compared outcomes in them what got beta-lactams versus those who got a glycopeptide. And those who got a glycopeptide had much higher mortality rates, 26% versus 11% if they had enterococcal bacteremia. Never use vancomycin unless you have absolutely no other option. It is always to your patient's detriment. There is this ongoing debate as to whether NSAIDs make necrotizing fasciitis worse. There's always been some epidemiological data to suggest that is indeed the case, and some systematic reviews have suggested that it is not the case that NSAIDs worsen group A strep infections. This study looked at streptococcal myonecrosis in mice. Okay, not human beings. But interestingly, in the mouse model, non-selective NSAIDs, such as ibuprofen, indomethacin, and ketorolac, worsened myonecrosis due to group A strep, had higher mortality rates, and caused antibiotics to be less effective when compared to selective COX-1 and COX-2 NSAIDs. Sometimes the knife blade upon which patients' health balances can be quite fine indeed, and I actually think that sometimes NSAIDs tip the infection in favor of the organism. This mouse model at least lends credence to the fact that NSAIDs potentiate the group A strep necrotizing infections. And certainly, if my mouse gets a sore throat due to group A strep, I'm not going to give it symptomatic relief with ibuprofen. Viridin streptococci can be a problem in the neutropenic. Perhaps we've selected for them because of quinolone and other prophylactic antibiotic use. But this study looked at Viridin streptococci in the neutropenic and found that the majority of severe infections were due to strep mitis. Not only that, but they found that strep mitis may indeed be more than two species. Why it is more virulent than the other Viridin streptococci in the neutropenia is of yet an unresolved question, although they do note in this review that it is a closely genetically related organism to Streptococcus pneumoniae, and this may give it an edge in virulence, especially in an immunocompetent patient. There's also a suggestion that strep mitis, in particular some subspecies, might be causing pneumonias in this group of patients. Not all Viridin strep are the same, and evidently in the neutropenic febrile, it is the mitis. There has to be some joke about go to mitis, get a muffler, but I can't think of how it would go. I sometimes report studies that I would never personally implement out of paranoia. Medically, I am somewhat conservative. This study looked at the treatment of osteomyelitis of the vertebrae, and they found that after 2.7 weeks, if they were switched to oral, that the patients did fine, that the cure rates were 97%, and that outcomes were every bit as good as IV therapy for the treatment of spinal osteomyelitis. The bulk of the infections were Staph aureus, 21%. I would be chicken to do this, in part because, well, in the real world, I would not rely upon patients to take all their oral medications. Often, vertebral osteo is in a population that may not necessarily be adherent with their compliance or compliant with their adherence, such as IV drug users. And unlike other bones of the body, you can't remove the spine, senators notwithstanding. So I would be hesitant to switch my osteomyelitis patients of the spine over to oral therapy, and although it would appear to work, I personally would be chicken. I've always been more of a proponent to the ceftriaxone macrolide treatment of community-acquired pneumonia than quinolone-based therapies for a variety of reasons. This study looked at subsequent isolation of multi-drug resistant organisms depending on treatment for community-acquired pneumonia, and they found that 15% of the moxifloxacin-treated patients developed, or at least had, MDROs isolated versus 4% for ceftriaxone azithromycin-treated patients. So it would appear, although the p was 0.026, not a great p-value, if you are a listener or reader over at Science-Based Medicine, you'll know that 0.005 is a better number probably for statistical significance. But it is interesting that the quinolones here would appear to be driving resistance more than the ceftriaxone azithromycin group. Quinolones are evil, and that might be a slight exaggeration. They have cardiac toxicities, they drive MRSA, they drive C. diff, they may indeed cause retinal detachment, they're associated with Achilles tendon rupture, they may not be as effective in community-acquired pneumonia, and they drive resistance of MDROs. They're certainly not the wonder drug that works wonders. And one of those curiosities, there was a meta-analysis of all the studies of obesity and outcomes in pneumonia, and there appears to be an obesity survival benefit for obese people who develop community-acquired pneumonia, at least in this meta-analysis. So the secret to staying healthy is to be obese and drink red wines, right? Maybe not so much. Since it may increase your survival with bacterial pneumonia, it also decreases your survival with influenza, so it's probably a wash overall. Sometimes I feel like Art Linkletter. Patients do the damnedest things. Some of you people may not remember who Art Linkletter was. This is an outbreak of Campylobacter coli diarrhea in 22 people. Why did they get this? Well, they're participating in a muddy, long-distance obstacle races that included lots of mud and getting in water, and this was on a cattle ranch. And they think that the Campylobacter was in the water, quote, inadvertent ingestion of muddy surface water contaminated with cattle or swine feces. It's amazing how often people do these muddy water long-distance races of a variety of types and come down with infections. Evidently, these are popular, with 1.5 million participants in 2002, according to the CDC. So yet another crazy epidemiologic risk for developing an infectious disease. I've talked in the past how some of the data suggest that Fusobacterium may be the cause of acute appendicitis and not obstruction. If that were the case, perhaps appendicitis would respond to antibiotics, and there was a recent trial that suggested that kids with appendicitis did fine with antibiotics. Now there's another study out of the United States which showed the same thing, and the children with uncomplicated acute appendicitis did fine with a course of antibiotics and being NPO. This is also true in another study in the elderly, where they found that antibiotic therapy in age 80 was reasonably effective. There were only 26 patients. The elderly don't often get appendicitis. But of those 26, 5 had recurrence, 3 required appendectomy, and 2 received new courses of antibiotics. So both in children and in adults, treatment with antibiotics may be sufficient for the treatment of appendicitis, which would make sense if it was due to an infection as opposed to obstruction. Again, me and my fun epidemiology. Gara rufa is a fish, and people get these fish pedicures where they stick their feet in the water filled with fish, and the fish nibble off all the dead skin. The microbiology of that water can at times be disgusting, and I've talked about that in the past, that the water that these fish live in is filled with potential pathogens, and of course, the fish are shitting in the water and then nibbling on your skin. This is a report, however, of a staph infection that followed after the Gara rufa fish nibbled off all the dead skin. I'm not sure if you can actually blame the fish or the water. I would like to know that there was staph in the water, which would seem unlikely, but the trauma may have been enough to set off the infection. Prosthetic infections, of course, are a nightmare. This looked at gram-negative prosthetic joint infections, where they debrided it, left it in, and gave them antibiotics. and found that if it was a ciprofloxacin susceptible organism and they nuked it with a long course of Cipro, that their success rate was remarkably high, 79%. I currently have a serratia knee infection. The source is uncertain, although the patient does have well water, and hopefully her infection will be taken care of with a long course of Cipro. Even worse than prosthetic joint infections or endovascular graft infections. They are remarkably difficult to treat, and some people actually need their arteries, so they're hard to remove. This study looked at outcomes of patients and found that if you had staph and you were able to give rifampin, that you had a reasonably good outcome for the treatment of your infection, with 75% of patients going into remission. I like that word, remission. It makes it sound like staph infection of a vascular graft is like a cancer, and it kind of is. But a 75% remission rate is pretty good for cancer or a staph infection of a vascular graft. A couple years back, we had an excellent grand rounds on the adverse effects of transfusions. We've actually had several of those. One of the lectures concerned the evils of free hemoglobin, which you can get in older red cells. But red cells themselves are foreign material, and you're getting sort of a red cell transplant, and that can be immunosuppressive. And amongst other things, infection rates can go up if you get lots of transfusions. A study in the JAMA was a meta-analysis of the effects of liberal versus a tight transfusion policy in hospitals and the effects on healthcare-associated infections, and found that the more liberal you were with your transfusions, the more healthcare-associated infections that were present. And they had a number needed to treat of a mere 38 to decrease infection rates, which is pretty good. Transfusions are bad for you. Of course, if your hemoglobin's 3, they're good. It's a risk versus benefit. But don't think that transfusions are pure chocolate cake and ice cream. Quantiferon or PPD, it always depends on what population you are testing. This was a study that looked at college students, of whom a significant proportion, about 20%, were out of the country. They compared the operative characteristics of the classic tuberculin skin test versus the quantiferon gold. They found that in high-risk groups, the PPD and the quantiferon were equal. However, as the risks declined, you had more and more positive quantiferons than you did tuberculin skin tests. So it would appear that the quantiferon in this population is less specific than a tuberculin skin test, with the caveat that we still don't have a gold standard for knowing who is and is not having latent tuberculosis. But it all, I suppose, gets down to your basic Bayesian analysis, that if your prior probability of a disease is low, as it would be in someone at no risk for tuberculosis, then a positive test is more likely to be a false positive than a true positive. If your prior plausibility is high, as in a high-risk group, your positivity is likely a true positivity rather than a false positivity. So which test should you use for the diagnosis of latent tuberculosis? I don't know. In some populations, it's been recommended that you do both, i.e. those who are going to get biologics like Rituxan. But in a low-risk population, it would probably be better to do a TST than a quantiferon. What we really need is an accurate test for the diagnosis of latent tuberculosis, and we still don't have that. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, or an ounce of perversion is worth a pound of pure. I forget what the right one is. However, that doesn't appear to be the case in preventing fungal infections. The prophylactic fluconazole studies were primarily a bust outside the neutropenic populations. And this study looked at empiric caspofungin prophylaxis in patients in a critical care setting. And they were followed along with twice-weekly beta-D-glucans. I'm sure the company who makes that test loved that study. And they found no difference in candidemia in the placebo versus the caspofungin arms, at least not that was statistically significant. 14 of 84 in the placebo group, 10 of 102 in the caspofungin group, for a P of a whopping 0.14. There was, however, a trend towards the benefit of caspofungin, so I guess you'd have to really do a ginormous study with more than 222 patients, and probably the number needed to treat, at least based on this preliminary trial, would be ginormous. And plus, you give caspofungin, you get caspofungin-resistant organisms. Use it and lose it should be the motto of the ICU. So if there is benefit, they're going to have to do a much higher powered study to prove it. This was the MSG-01 study, so I assumed at least that for the treated patients, their Chinese food tasted better. I've never particularly liked the smell of the citron candles for driving away mosquitoes. Now, mosquitoes are attracted predominantly to carbon dioxide. The best way not to get mosquitoes is to not breathe. But this study looked at how mosquitoes are attracted to molasses that's being fermented by yeast, and found that mosquitoes were quite attracted to the CO2 that was produced by fermenting molasses. So maybe this summer, rather than light some candles on the porch, I will pour some molasses and some Saccharomyces into a jar and see if the mosquitoes go to that instead. Especially since we're due for some West Nile in the Pacific Northwest, finally. We keep waiting. And of course I keep harping about chikungunya. But yeast-fermented molasses, sounds good. At any given time, my theory is that most docs can only remember 2 antibiotics. And those current 2 antibiotics are vancomycin and pip/tazo. This study looked retrospectively at whether or not patients received piperacillin, tazo, and vancomycin, or cefepime and vancomycin, and found that even when you matched them for severity of illness, there was a much higher rate of nephrotoxicity, or acute kidney injury, I should say, than those on the piperacillin, tazo, vancomycin group, 34.8% versus 12%. The P was impressive, 0.0001. And even after adjusting for potential biases, the P was 0.003. So it would appear you're more likely to get acute kidney injury on pip/tazo and vanco as opposed to, say, cefepime and vancomycin. If true and reproduced, that would really put that combination much lower on the list of drugs, when currently I would bet it is the most popular combination. And finally, we'll finish off with a little infection control for fun. One was an outbreak of extended spectrum beta-lactamases in an ICU, which they traced to their sinks. I thought this has occurred at some of my hospitals in the past, but it did not. But be very careful about the water coming into your hospital, and the outlet of the faucets can become infected or at least colonized with potential pathogens. They used self-disinfecting siphons in the ICU sinks and got rid of the problem. There's also another report on kitchens as the source of drug-resistant bacteria. Certainly, chickens and other animals are a good source of multi-drug-resistant organisms like Campylobacter and Salmonella and E. coli. And if you're cutting up your chickens in your hospital kitchen and not careful, it could be spread upstairs to your patients. So this study out of Switzerland found that the kitchens were a good source of drug-resistant bacteria. And finally, how are you going to disinfect your iPad? This study compared Clorox wipes with Sanicloth's CHG 2% and found that Sanicloth was effective for sterilizing, or at least disinfecting, the iPad for MRSA and VRE. It did not get C. difficile, but it did not damage the iPad. One would have to be a little careful about water damage, I would think. But the iPad seems to tolerate the Santa Claus CHG 2% just fine, at least in this careful study. And that brings us to the end of yet another exciting Puscast, covering the last 2 weeks of April 2014. References are available online. Don't forget your duty to human civilization to go online and write me glowing reviews on iTunes, as well as visiting the websites that I participate in, EdgyDoc, where links to my growing multimedia empire, Science-Based Medicine, and the all-new Society for Science-Based Medicine. References are available online, and as always, thank you for this most interesting consultation and allowing me to participate in the care of this most difficult and challenging case. I will continue to follow along with you. Thank you. In dictation. Goodbye.